This is Groove Talk with FrogE Style.
Welcome to another episode of Groove Talk, everybody. On this episode, I am joined by Adam, and he is the station manager at CJSW.
Hey, thanks for having me here, Cody.
Thank you very much for being on the show. So I guess just to start, why don't you tell the audience kind of like what your role is here and maybe even a little bit of background information about CJSW?
Certainly. I am the station manager, as you correctly identified at the top of the show, of CJSW. I've been in this role since July of 2017, and I've been a volunteer here for 20 years on top of that. The station's history can be traced back to the 1950s on the SAIT campus. There was a student radio society there without a radio station, mind you. And that's actually how every campus station like ours across the country, there's over 140 or so stations like ours across the country. The society then moved to the U of C campus in 1968 when the school opened. And then in 1983, the society finally got their FM broadcast license. Now, before that, they were broadcasting in the halls and dorms of McEwen Hall, as well as the dormitories on campus as well. We don't broadcast there anymore. Our programming is kind of maybe a little too out there for most folks, which is actually a good thing for freaking out the norms. We're doing our job. But CJSW has been broadcasting FM since August of '83, and in that time we've grown in leaps and bounds with technology. We are very fortunate to have a strong listener support in this town, and has helped make us one of the biggest, if not the biggest, station of our kind in the country. And one of the big reasons of why that is what we do. We shine a light on things that aren't given platforms elsewhere, and that can relate to the fact that we were the first station in town to play hip-hop, first station in town to play punk rock, the only station in town to play metal, and so many things that I guess now we take for granted, but if you look through the lens of 1983 Calgary, it's like, whoa,
yeah,
who are these people playing all this far-out music by like Devo or, Public Enemy or what have you. And, we've grown and evolved that, and we continue to grow and evolve. And where we are going to is we are Calgary's campus and community radio. Our station is programmed by volunteers, and they bring their unique musical perspectives and voice to the proceedings here at the station, which runs 24/7, 365. And, we've had programmers here for 30 years. We've had programmers here for 3 months. We get an entire gamut of experience levels, as well as musical point of views and cultural point of views. Like, you can't see it, dear listener, but we are in one of our production studios here at the University of Calgary campus at our facilities, and adjacent to us are programmers doing spoken word programming. And, that's actually kind of a big unique thing that we do too, is the points of view that we share. We are the only station that I'm aware of in town, actually the only media outlet I'm aware of in the province that does land acknowledgements for the fact that we are on Treaty 7 land and Métis Nation Region 3, which is a big part of addressing some of the social challenges I think that have been cropping up recently, or that talk about how do we do reconciliation, stuff like that. We are at the tip of the spear at that, and that's an extraordinarily important thing, especially considering all the change in media that's happened in the last 2 or 3 decades.
I agree. So I guess I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of CJSW, but maybe they're not kind of aware of like how things work here. Could you maybe just give us like a little breakdown on that, like kind of like a behind the scenes look at it?
Behind the scenes look. Well, I think if we're going to look at behind the scenes, the first place we have to start is with volunteerism. Okay. And that's what this station is founded on. As I was trying to dragoon you into our service prior to this interview, volunteerism is what makes this place run. Yeah. And it's extraordinary. As I had mentioned, we have programmers and volunteers that have been here for decades that they help out in very unique ways, as well as the ones that just walk through our door, that they help out in very unique ways. And that sort of energy, and when you look at volunteerism, that is someone giving up their time, talent, and energy to help give their effectively their vote on what is important in their life. And every one of our volunteers recognizes the importance of what an independent media voice is in town, especially in the day and age we live in, where more and more things are owned by corporate conglomerates and there's less independently owned media. When I joined this station, there was a TV station that just started up called A Channel, ostensibly independent station that thrived for a little while and then was bought out by City TV. And when that got bought out, or you can look at Access Television, which was killed by the Klein government in the 90s. Like these were crazy platforms where people could get a local voice and get local exposure. There's none of that now. We are like one of the last institutions standing for this stuff. Actually, campus media is one of the last bastions of independent critical media, which is great. We aren't necessarily driven by advertising concerns. We do advertising here, and that's a common misconception is, you guys don't ad, but like, are we advertising like new pickup trucks or Tim Hortons coffee? No, we give our advertising bandwidth because we are regulated on how much advertising we do. That bandwidth is committed to like showcasing local arts, culture, social events, stuff like that, as well as working with small business in town, independent business, to kind of let a broader audience know, because there may be people in Somerset that don't know about Cafe Beano, or people in Thorncliffe that have heard about this cool Ethiopian restaurant in the International BRZ, and they usually hear about it through us because we do have that reach, which is we estimate at any given time 20,000 listeners or so on FM, and then 20 to 30,000. It all depends on time of day, of course. But and as well as online, which it's interesting, the diaspora of people that love this station, that either got acquainted with it because they lived in Calgary at one point or another, or have been drawn to it by our content, our frankly award-winning content, because we do fairly well in terms of recognition for our content that we produce here in-house every year at the National Campus Radio Awards. So that's kind of a thing. Now, other back of house stuff that you're kind of curious about, what do you want to know? There's so much. There's HR, there's funding, there's policy, all that kind of fun stuff.
I guess how do you decide what kind of programming makes it onto the air?
Ooh, that's a great question. And our program director, Marta, I would love to hear her weigh in on this, but generally the philosophy is like people that exhibit like an interest and passion in music, as well as having maybe an interesting perspective. And this is like speaking largely to music programs. For instance, right now airing is The Blues Witness. That's hosted by Cindy McLeod. She is the executive director of the Calgary International Blues Festival. She has been in the blues and music world in general for like probably well over 40 years. And she brings like this really informed, expert sort of take on the world of contemporary blues. And she puts a lot of emphasis on Canadian and local talent too. So like those kind of personalities are the people you want to give a platform to. It's like, no, you have something to say, and you're actually maybe showcasing a group that doesn't get a lot of exposure elsewhere. Like when you think of it, blues makes up, no one buys music these days, but of the stuff that is bought, blues makes up an extraordinarily small percentage amount. So like it is important to kind of showcase it, because the roots of so much of our popular music today can be traced to the blues, So that type of personality, like what Cindy brings to our station is, exactly what we're looking for. But I should also say, she's an experienced veteran. That isn't the only qualifier. We have a programmer who's doing a show tonight, who's 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
She is a violin prodigy and has a very, very accessible and enchanting program that focuses on classical music. And classical music, when you say that gets people's hair up on end one way or another, because like there's a lot of baggage with that. It's always seemed to be a little bit bougie and or pompous in terms of how it's maybe discussed commonly. But what Fiona, this young programmer, does is really makes it accessible and kind of explains what is a concerto, what is a sonata, like all these different things that that maybe people more experienced in the classical world or like take for granted, that like there's a lot of lay people out there that don't know the architecture of the genre and the history, and like the fact that I get to hear tuba concertos, which I've never heard before, on her show, and have it communicate with such enthusiasm makes me want to listen to classical music more. And that kind of ability to kind of build enthusiasm or tell a great story is a huge reason why she's on air. And the fact that she is an incredible volunteer too. She helps out in a lot of very unique ways around the station. So, there's a job for anyone. We have people with a lot of different abilities and skill sets and whatever. But, as with all sort of opportunities, like the more energy you put in, the more you get out. So, and Fiona's a good example of getting a lot out of all the effort she's put in.
Cool. I definitely agree with what you said about like when you see somebody getting excited about something, it kind of makes you more interested in what they're getting excited about. When you see somebody approach something with passion, you're like, oh, okay, you can like kind of see where they're coming from almost, And I found so much cool new music just from that, like having people on this show and just seeing them get excited about their music, and then you listen to it and you're like, you can like almost hear the passion in the music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why, I think, with the rise of things like Spotify, that's a cool thing where the algorithms, sometimes they're on, sometimes they're not. But one thing they don't do is contextualize and kind of share that passion and enthusiasm. It's very antiseptic, very, very... I find it treats music like wallpaper sometimes, where when you can breathe life into music, like Fiona, a 16-year-old kid who can breathe life into a composer that's been dead for 70 years or whatever, that's an extraordinary skill. And that kind of human touch is something that I think people will always need and gravitate to. Do I think there's a place in the world for Spotify? Hell yeah. It's a great tool to make playlists. But is it the best way to learn about music? No, not exactly, because you don't get that narrative going along with it. Yeah,
I definitely agree with that. Spotify, great for making playlists. I use it exclusively for that. I'm probably one of the last of my friends, at least, to get Spotify. I only got it a couple of months ago, just exclusively for making playlists for the podcast. Actually, I've always been more of a kind of an album guy. I like to purchase the music and get the full album and kind of give it a listen through at least a couple times. But if I am going to sit down and listen to music, I always like to listen to the whole thing and see how it was meant to be heard. How the artist who made it wanted that whole piece of work to be listened to,
Oh, absolutely.
So Spotify, I agree. It's good and bad. It's kind of made music more convenient in a way, but I feel like that in itself has kind of made people maybe appreciate music a little less.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's funny, I'm going to go out on a bit of a tangent, but, I think of the discussion about building a new arena in town. The argument's being made, well, we got to have these big concerts we're missing out on these big concerts. And personally, I think those big concerts are going to be dead in 10 to 20 years. The people that are packing arenas now, I think of a bunch of musicians that are probably from our parents and or maybe grandparents' generation that are making music. They aren't going to be doing it in 10 to 15 years. Mm-hmm. And I just think about the artists today that don't necessarily have those iconic albums. You don't have a Iron Maiden Number of the Beast or a Fleetwood Mac Rumors or whatever it may be. The things that have been used in countless commercials and movies and all that kind of stuff. It's all these vestiges of modern monoculture will be less and less important. And actually, I think it'll be smaller concerts. It'll be I think of a band like the Arcade Fire, they're almost 20 years old as a band. You know, but you know, I think they should be in line to fill out those 20,000 seaters. I don't think that's going to happen. They'll probably, you know, get 2,000 seaters probably until the day they die, which is great for them. But you know, that scale of maybe like music awareness, you know, I kind of think Spotify has a part to play in this. Is like, you know, you don't know the albums. You don't know the artwork with it. You don't know the iconography that goes along with these things through that service, which I think we still kind of demonstrate a little bit. And in our way, we're not necessarily out there to kind of sell the world on the virtues of Fleetwood Mac or whatever. They've been treated very well by FM rock radio for 50 years. But what we do is actually archive and tell the stories of the music that's happening today in a way that I don't trust Spotify to be the guardian of. So, as for instance, have you heard of that Native North American comp that Light in the Attic put out 2 or 3 years ago, won a Grammy?
Nope.
Okay, so this is a 4 LP set of Indigenous artists, largely from Canada, that was all recorded by the CBC from the 60s through the 80s.
Okay.
CBC isn't really doing that work anymore. We're doing that work. We are, like I was mentioning off mic earlier, we do 130 live performances in our space a year, and we're hopefully making those footprints that'll, you know, like impact generations, you know, decades to come when, you know, when it's digitized on Spotify. Like, how would you ever find out about Willie Thrasher, like without, you know, a institution like CJSW kind of pointing in the right direction, or a label like Light in the Attic going to a service like ours and saying, hey, do you have any cool live recordings that we can make a compilation album out of, and so forth. So yeah, that was a very long tangent. I'm sorry.
That's what podcasts are for, honestly. It makes my job a lot easier when the guest likes to go off on tangents.
Well, I appreciate your patience.
I encourage tangents.
Duly noted.
Yeah. But like even some of my favorite local bands, you know, they have albums up on Bandcamp or whatever, and it's live at CJSW, you know, and that's just awesome to see. It's just I think it's giving voices to the local musicians who might not otherwise, you know, have a voice.
Absolutely. That's funny you use those exact words, because our station's ethos and kind of slogan, as it were, has been giving voice to the voiceless. And that's been it from day one. And that's kind of our guiding principles. Sure, there's lots of regulations and policies and all that kind of stuff, but our kind of banner statement that I think everyone here at the station has adhered to and respected and cherished is the fact that we do have the ability to kind of share the stories of underrepresented bands and, you know, viewpoints and what have you.
Yeah, and it's something that I can definitely resonate with, because it's like one of the founding principles of why I even started this podcast is I just knew a lot of really cool musicians, and I felt like, you know, I wanted to share that with people. I wanted to tell people about it. I wanted people to get to know these people the way I did, you know? And I quickly ran out of friends to interview, so I branched out and started looking at other local bands that I really enjoyed. And it's really cool to hear that, you know, when they come on my podcast, a lot of them are like, this is the first podcast I've ever done. Thank you so much for having me and stuff. I'm like, oh, wow. Well, like, thank you for coming. Like, it's just a really neat experience to be kind of part of these bands' journey.
For sure.
Yeah.
You know, and the part of the story we tell with these bands is, you know, like a lot of these bands, sure, they're coming in, they're a local band. They got to, you know, they're playing Sled Island Festival. So, like, that's a great festival in town, or the Folk Fest, or whatever it may be. It's like we get to kill two birds with one stone. We get to showcase this local talent, which is incredibly important because, you know, if we can't appreciate what's in our own backyard, you know, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
As well as kind of let people know that, you know, yeah, we actually have this cool music festival in town called Sled Island, or the Calgary Underground Film Fest, or whatever it may be. Those organization institutions don't necessarily have the budget to advertise with Bell Media or whatever like that, because, you know, or get any sort of exposure. So we do fulfill an incredibly important part. And, you know, there has been challenges about, you know, losing other outlets in town that kind of did the same work except with a different media per se. Like, you know, like I think of like Fast Forward magazine, which was our local arts and culture weekly, which sadly died in I think 2015. There's so much that has been lost by that, you know, and I don't want to envision a future where there isn't some sort of local media that whose mandate and raison d'etre is to showcase all the great things happening in town, as well as all the great content and art and music that is being produced here in town and abroad.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, one of the saddest things that I hear from some of my friends is, you know, there's nothing going on in Calgary, and I just kind of look at them. I'm like, are you serious? There's something going on literally every weekend. You just have to look, and it's just because I don't think that they're kind of tuned in to, like, you know, the community aspect of it. You know, they're just listening to like the mainstream media and stuff like that. But if you really look, there's so much going on in Calgary almost every day of the week.
Completely.
And I think stuff like this and community media in general is just really important, because I think a lot of people kind of lack that sense of community in today's day and age. And it's kind of, I think, what's largely responsible for kind of the like rampant mental health issues that are kind of going on nowadays. Is just nobody's connected anymore, you know? And
the polarization of political discourse and social discourse.
Yeah.
Like the villainization of the other.
Yeah.
That's all. You can draw a straight line by, you know, people engaging less with maybe community media or like kind of putting themselves out into discovery instead of like just looking what's in their feed or what's shared by their moron friends on the internet. You know, like those sorts of things are completely corrosive, and that's a huge reason why I think, you know, a station like ours is more important now than ever. Even like I wasn't really an active member of the scene in the early 80s. I was like a baby, but from what I've heard from some of the old timers around here, like, yeah, Calgary was even like a big redneck town, and, you know, playing Devo on the radio was like, whoa, what a crazy thing. But, you know, the funny thing is, like, actually a funny story about that is that was one of the tracks that or bands that got us out of broadcast here in Mac Hall and in the dorms. I was like, oh, you're playing this weird music like Devo. and this was in like 1983. In 1984, they release Freedom of Choice, which has the hit song Whip It on it. And like everyone's listening to Devo then. Like, goes back to that tip of the spear thing. We were like, we're showing tomorrow's hits today and tomorrow's viewpoints today. And if you want to be ahead of the curve, tune in wherever you live or are to your independent media, be the campus or community-based, whatever. Like, having that unfettered freedom of expression is an incredibly important thing.
I agree. And I think it kind of goes back to what you said about people, the people who work here are volunteers, and they're casting their vote with their time, you know? That they think that it's worth having an independent radio station, and it is, definitely, because it just even if it was just for the community aspect of it, just the community outreach and just like letting people know what's going on in the community, like that is in itself, I think, an invaluable thing.
Totally. I've voted in every single election I've been eligible for, because I do believe in the power of democracy, no matter how distorted, skews, or mutated it might be. But I don't think I've ever felt like I've voted as impactfully as I have through my volunteerism at CJSW. Like, you know, I think I've reached more people, or like we kind of tried to do more to create the world I would love to live in. You know, and that might be a very idyllic view on things, but you know, when you look at it, like, because I do have a 20-year track record of volunteering at this place, it's like, no, I've like, and it's been reflectively good. Like, you know, there's certain bands that I've helped along the way, and, you know, that kind of helps me get a job at the National Music Center when I worked there and stuff like that. You know, it's just it's a great ecosystem to be a part of. And whether you're a listener or volunteer, like, you are voting, and, you know, hopefully that means the same to you out there, dear listener.
Yeah. So I guess you did say that you've been involved with CJSW for 20 years. So I guess kind of maybe let's take us along that path a little bit.
Oh, geez. Okay, so I grew up with oldies radio, like 66 CFR, because you would get to listen to Flames games on that. I was a big hockey guy when I was a kid. And then kind of classic rock radio. And I those were the only type of music I was really exposed to for the most part. But I had one job where I had to sit in my car for like 3 or 4 hours and just watch customers coming in and out of a store, which gives you a lot of time to listen to radio. And, you know, I switched the dial over to the left to 90.9 and FM, and I heard this weird music. And I was like, this is kind of cool. And then the host goes on and explained this weird music. And then this host, who's still kind of a member at large at the station, was reading passages of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Like he was like, and then played more music that kind of related to the passages. And I was like, wow, this is like a performance piece. This isn't like, this is weird. I got to get into it.
Yeah.
So I walked into the station in December of 97 and then was on air trained by the summer of 98 and had my own show by the fall of 98. And, you know, through in that time over the years, I've met some of the best friends I will probably ever have, you know, girlfriends, bandmates, you name it. Like, employers have all been here. And then, you know, and that's kind of grown and elevated. And, you know, when you join as an 18-year-old, you know, you have those kind of concerns. And it's been something I've been able to grow with. I'm 40 years old now, and it's something that has never felt out of place. I think that's just the culture we have of, like, you know, we do have programmers in their 80s as well as in their teens here, and everyone in between. So that element is, and I've always had an ardent passion for discovering the new and unknown, which this station scratches that itch heavily. Like, I love hearing new music. I know you're supposed to only ever love the music you heard when you were a teenager, but actually I like the music I'm hearing now more than ever.
Yeah.
But and I think there's countless members of our society that would have similar sort of stories, and I would argue that listeners too. Like, we have generations of listeners that, you know, we have some people that have supported us during our funding drive every year for like 25 plus years, which is extraordinary. But, you know, that's kind of a personal take on it. Now, in terms of like a meta take on it, this business has changed as much as the print industry, and it's really facing its next big hurdles, which will be an exciting challenge, a challenge nonetheless. But, you know, as I stated earlier, like, the value of what we do here is an important record and living archive of what's going on in town all the time. Yeah, I can't wait to see what the next few years look like, because I do think there's going to be some big shifts. And you know, to be honest with you, I think stations like ours will outlast, you know, the commercial radio stations out there, because, you know, people that want to listen to a classic rock playlist can just type in classic rock playlist on Spotify and you get all the same jams without any of the truck advertisements or whatever.
Exactly.
You know, but where we do and what we pride ourselves in is the fact that we have our fingers on the pulse of what's happening right now. We have people sending in music to us all the time. So many different formats. Like, albums are changing a lot. The impact of an album can be measured in weeks, where previously it was measured in months. So a lot of genres, for instance, are just releasing singles. In a weird way, it's almost like the 60s, where it was a singles market. And then, you know, in the 70s became very much an album market. We're seeing a little bit more of a regression, or not a regression, because that's a negative sounding word. It's more of an evolution back to a singles market.
Yeah, it's kind of like looping around.
Completely, because people now, it's like, no, it's actually considering the infrastructure of how to play music and the tools being used, as well as the audience, as well as the people that will be doing the playing. It's sometimes better to put on just your two best songs on a Bandcamp release versus, you know, going $4,000 into debt to get records pressed, as a ostensibly a vanity project.
Yeah, I think it kind of stems to the like society now is it's like such like an instant gratification society, you know, with like Vines and YouTube videos and just all the content that you could ever want at your fingertips. People, their attention span just seems to be way shorter than it like has ever been.
For sure.
And I think that, you know, exactly what you said, it's more profitable to put your effort into a couple good songs and release it, say, every couple months, instead of putting a year's worth of effort into an album and you're releasing one album per year.
Totally.
Yeah.
And but that kind of change is like a total sea change from what I experienced when I walked in here. So, for instance, like our music department 20 years ago would probably get 100 physical releases a week, no digital. 10 years ago, we probably got 50 or 60 physical releases a week, 10 digital. Now we get maybe 12 to 20 physical releases a week, probably 60 to 80 digital albums, and then probably another 100 digital singles.
Oh, wow.
So it like just the process of, getting all that sorted, collated in people's ears has changed a lot. And we have a very dynamic team here that are really rising to that challenge right now. And because the last thing we want is to be kind of out of touch, as it were, or kind of so set in our ways that we aren't able to evolve with the changes that are going to be happening, as well as like the infrastructure of listening to radio. Like, it's interesting talking with some of our younger volunteers. It's like, oh, you never grew up with radio, you just had YouTube and Apple Music growing up. Cool. Oh, you don't have a radio at home? No, you don't? Okay, well, you listen on the computer? Great. And now we've actually got our programming on Spotify in addition to CJSW.com, which is it's one thing to bemoan, like, oh, the world's changing, I don't want to change, but it's another thing to actually just say, no, these are the tools people are using. We got to go with what people are using. Like, it's a far easier conversation than, wow, if we could only get the entire population to shut off Spotify and buy a radio or buy a car, because there's car ownership's changing a lot too. With ride sharing, I want to do an experiment of like, car to goes. Like, how often do people tune into us in a car to go? I don't know how we work that, but that's a future project for me.
So I guess where do you see what does the future of radio look like in your eyes, I guess?
Well, as I alluded to before, I think it's going to be far more local centric. And that's why, I do think we'll outlast the big commercial stations, because they have one program director for a region, and at the end of the day, they're there to sell A&W ads and trucks and whatever, which is cool. And I'm not, there's a place in this world for us all. It's funny, the commercial radio was always the big bad demon 20 years ago. Now it's like, I could care less, because I think we have such a distinctive sound and we offer such a distinctive thing outside of commercial radio that I'm not super worried about it. I'm more worried about like, what happens if we aren't successful in letting people know about exploring us through services like Spotify or on CJSW.com, which archives all our broadcasts for at least 3 months, and you can subscribe to whatever show you want and whatever. So what we've really tried to focus on is building an on-demand service, and like, this is going with that instant gratification. No one, I think spoken word programming is a good example of this. So we were talking about podcasting earlier. We broadcast certain programs like spoken word, like seeing Writer's Block being taped there. They get a one spot a month. It's like the second Thursday of the month, I think, for their broadcast. That's a hard one to kind of keep in your mental schedule of it. But if you want to type in Writer's Block, CJSW.com, you get to see the last 12 months worth of broadcast. So you can just binge listen in the same way people like binge watching TV shows these days. And that is something I think, we've got a leg up on, because we do have unique enough programming to inspire that. Whereas, like if it's just like another day of, top 40 stuff, it may not have the same sway. You can always just put in top 40 of the 80s or whatever and get all the 80s party bangers you could shake a stick at, but you know, if you don't know about maybe Throbbing Gristle or Talk Talk or some of the more esoteric 80s bands, you know, you're missing out. And that's where we come in, as well as, you know, that local focus, I think is going to be a good thing for us. You know, the fact that we are telling the stories no one tells, and that has differentiated us enough from, you know, other radio stations, as well as, you know, options like, you know, YouTube or Spotify and stuff like that. So for small radio stations like us that have a strong community engagement and focus, I think we're in pretty good shape. There's going to be upheaval and tumult and, you know, change, and that's just life. You know, we might be living under 5 feet of water, and, you know, by the time we're both old, you know, so like there's a lot of, it could be Mad Max dystopia in 30 years. Who knows? Yeah. But under current conditions, I see us, or in stations like ours, doing okay, and actually probably getting more and more value, especially if people kind of make themselves aware of some of those challenges that you were detailing earlier about, like how, you know, you get a very myopic view of the world by living through your Facebook feed. Like, you don't see the whole picture. You only see the stuff that's either algorithmed to you, your dumb friends share, whatever. The potential of the unknown entering your life isn't there. Everything is so tailored to target you so hard. We're like an exploration into the unknown, and that I would like to think will resonate with folks, and you know, make us like a viable media option for decades to come.
Yeah, and I think something like that is incredibly valuable. Just something that does get away from the mainstream and does expose you to, whether it be new ideas or new musics or new spoken word programs or whatever. I think that's so valuable to everyone, just to like get you outside of your bubble. Like, it's the same reason why traveling to a different country is valuable, you know, to see how other people live, just get a broader view on the world in general, you know. So
totally. You hit the nail on the head. Like, the other is not something to be feared. It's something to embrace, and it's something to discover, because there's always going to be a lot more other than that which you know. And if, like, you can live on such a narrow path of what's comfortable and or unchallenging for you, man, you're like, I pity you, because that's really shutting the door on, you know, life's rich pageant that, you know. But yeah, I guess the potential of what we do offer there is kind of unparalleled. You know, sure, the internet's cool and you can really discover anything, but where do you even start?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, we can give you at least starting points. And there's often the case, like, you know, one of the cool things about our programming on CJSW.com, that when it gets archived there, it has track listings. So often we get people texting into the booth as like, what was that last song? It's like, yeah, it was this guy. You check out my full playlist here. And then, you know, the next week they come in, it's like, oh, I checked your playlist. That, you know, that band was so crazy. What's the story on them? And, you know, not only are you sharing music with someone, you're actually building a relationship with someone, like, in the ether, which is kind of a cool thing that we do. And, you know, I guess a lot of people there's a cliche, I should say, with campus radio about, like, it's like like people that sound dopey behind mic and whatever. It's like, yeah, sometimes that happens, but it's real. It's not like some guy who's just like, hey, it's Monday morning, who's excited, you know, like that kind of stuff. I think wears thin really quick, and people have a natural, I would like to think people have a natural tendency to go for the genuine versus the contrived. So
I would definitely agree with that, and I think that's why things like podcasting are becoming a big thing, and even just like YouTube videos of people just playing video games and just being, I think that people are just getting so fed up with all this staged media, whether it be TV, whether it be radio, music, whatever. I think people are just, they're looking for something more nowadays, because they're just so sick of being kind of spoon-fed the same staged thing, you know. It gets old. You're right. It's not something that I think is going to be viable in the future.
Oh, totally. I think the most explicit example of that kind of stage stuff is if you look at summer blockbusters. In a weird way, I think the marketing test groups that they make those movies for are like, you are on a cross-country airline flight. We need a movie that is this exciting, with this little violence, this little nudity, this type of certain I guess Venn diagram that it needs to be. And it made I think summer blockbusters into kind of a template sort of thing where, you know, it's easy to maybe, you know, take a crap on like the Marvel comic universe, which, you know, some of those movies are pretty good and some of them are like kind of crappy, but there's a template there. There's no surprises.
No.
It's so measured, and it really seems like they're going for that top of the bell curve of social artistic appreciation or whatever. And I don't know, there's a lot of other weirdos out there, like, you know, that you gotta get their opinions on. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I think more and more people want to see kind of what's like behind the scenes, you know? They want to look at how the process is being made. And like, yeah, like you said, Marvel movies, they're great. They're entertaining, most of them. But it is a template. It has to be like this funny. There's this much humor in it with this much action in it. And it just gets old after a while.
Yeah, it's very heteronormative. And the guy always gets the girl and all that kind of shit.
Exactly. You know exactly what's going to happen. There's not going to be any twists. The good guy's going to prevail at the end. The hero's going to come out on top. And I think that's why things like, you know, when Deadpool came out, Deadpool was like a kind of a step away from that. It was still a superhero movie, but there was gore, there was swearing, there was... It was different, you know? So... Yeah,
and for many folks, you know, like, more relatable.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, than like hyper virtuous characters that are like, I gotta save the world. Like, this is going on to another tangent, but I always found Superman the most boring superhero. It's like, he can only be killed by unobtainium, and he can turn back time and fly, and he's bulletproof, and all this, like, shoots lasers out of his eyes. Like, who cares? Like, he's like, okay, like, why don't you just call it God or whatever? Like, because it seems like he has divine power.
Yeah.
And I don't know, where Deadpool is like a far more interesting thing is like kind of disfigured and grumpy and acerbic, and, you know, a lot of feelings that people actually have, not just like, I've got to be Clark Kent when I'm not Superman, and you know, very rigid and two-dimensional. So
and I think like things like, you know, the unattainable superhero virtue and stuff, it's kind of like having its impact on society as well, you know? It's making people be like, you know, this is what a good person is. Like, I'm so far away from that. I have these thoughts, you know, and it's just kind of causing like a rift almost, you know? And
for sure. Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. Like, I think of... it's society right now is actually super strange. We could have a separate podcast and just talk about sociology and stuff like that. But just like the juxtaposition between, you know, what you see is virtuous in superhero movies, and then what you see as virtuous in real life. You know, like people, you know, that may be adopting, you know, attitudes and mindsets that, you know, 75 years ago their grandparents went over to Europe or the Pacific to fight. Like the forces that were champions of those same ideals that are now being lauded as mainstream. And that it's so strange. Like, I wonder how many Captain America fans are Trump voters, you know, like, frankly, that's what it boils down to. It's like,
like I said, we kind of talked about it when you were showing me the record room there, but like the accessibility to make music now has been, you know, it's accessible to anybody who has like a couple $100 to rent some gear, a computer program. They can all make music. They can all throw it up on the internet. I guess, so what are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, that's a spicy meatball. It's the best and the worst thing that's ever happened to music. You know, the best in the sense that, anyone can make music. And I think of how many, you know, artists have come through the ages that we'll never know about, frankly, because they never got recording contracts. They may have actually had some really cool things. And one may only look to things like the Pebbles comps or Back from the Grave comps or When Birdman Flew comps, all these like weird collections of 60s garage music or whatever that never got like major label. They got like local and or regional label pressings, and maybe a few hundred copies of their 7-inch was printed back in the 1960s. That, you know, missing out on that on a main, like I guess a mainstream monoculture sort of field, you know, that was a big loss at the time for people, but a huge boon for us now. We can all hear it, which is super, super cool. And discover about all these wild things. Like, you know, 60s music is more than the Beatles and the Stones. It's, you know, it's Zachary Thax or Bubble Puppy or, you know, like all these strange bands that never kind of made it, as it were. So that's kind of cool. And, you know, I guess, you know, at that time, it was in many ways more reflective of our times than, you know, the 5 decades in between now and the mid 60s. Now, in terms of the bad parts of it, you know, with everyone being able to make music, everyone's able to make music. It makes it very difficult for kind of quote unquote tastemakers and gatekeepers, which are loaded terms and often construed as negative, but in many ways they're very positive terms. I think of Ahmet Ertegun from Atlantic Records, you know, archetype of a gatekeeper, but he's the guy who discovered, you know, like Aretha Franklin and, you know, like did all this, released all the cool Atlantic soul stuff because it was like, no, this is something special. Like we have a budget to do this and a medium to do this, so we're gonna record these people because they're the best there. Which in turn over the decades has left this wonderful breadcrumb trail for anyone living in the year 2019 to like follow this back and like, oh, I better go discover these all crazy soul sides and that were there, and like it's because it's on Atlantic and their soul kicked ass. That's great, and I'll check this out. It's that vetting. It's kind of a third party endorsement. Like,
yeah,
you know, the fact that you're getting a third party to put their money where your mouth is, that's a very impactful thing. And like a lot of, you know, having kind of gotten into this world 20 years ago, where, you know, I followed labels, and I still do follow labels as much as I do artists, because it's like, oh yeah, I know Larry Hardy from In the Red Records in California releases the best garage rock, and like I always check out his releases just because like he's put his stamp on that, and it helps because it's overwhelming. Like as I was mentioning to you earlier about how music's submitted to us, you know, we get effectively 3 times this amount of music submitted to us now, which is like awesome. But it's also when it's in a digital format, it becomes very invisible really, really quickly. So, you know, having that third party endorsement, I do think is a valuable thing. And, you know, maybe it's changing where it's like, yeah, and maybe it's always been this way too. And this could be argued that, you know, anyone like those 60s garage rock guys I was citing earlier is like, yeah, they were able to get their records pressed through like an independent label or their friend or whatever. They, you know, got money one way or another to kind of put out this record, which is cool. But, you know, having that is a little impenetrable to a degree when you consider there's like, where do you even begin to start on finding out what's good, what's bad, whatever. That's where maybe the algorithms are actually handy, is because they can actually sort like billions of data or pieces of data into a few thousand streams, whereas they, you know, us as, you know, radio programmers, like we're only limited by the amount of time we have in our lives to kind of like discover all this kind of stuff, and then in turn create space for it as well. Like, now that's an interesting thing relating to this whole question you had is, you know, top of the charts 15 years ago at CJSW, you would need to get 40 spins per week. Now you probably get 6 to 8.
Okay.
And that's kind of reflective of the fact that there's just so much more music to go off of, and you know, it's monoculture splintered out so much more into like tiny little fragments where it's like, oh yeah, I only like, you know, SoundCloud hip hop that comes out of LA, circa 2017 to 2018. Like like you can get really nichey in your genre thing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's like it's actually a good testament to the fact that there's always something new coming out musically. It's not like, oh, it just sounds the same as this band. It's like,
Yeah.
no, there's always evolution there. It's just, that comes, when you get something new and out there, it takes away from something else. So, will that top charting band get the same number of plays? Because the weight of numbers of everyone else on the charts kind of dilutes their impact. And that once again relates to why I think, maybe 2,000 seater venues will be more appropriate in 10 to 15 years than 20,000 seaters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like music itself is kind of going that way. Like just the evolution of music, it's diversifying into something. With technology and the way things are going, you can find like a 2-man band that plays electronic music with harmonica and banjo, you know what I mean? Or a 1-man band who sounds like a full band, and just like it's things I feel like they've become like so much more diverse than they've ever been.
Oh, for sure.
And I feel like the music listener themselves have become a little bit more diverse as well.
Yep.
You don't necessarily find like, oh, I'm only into punk rock or I'm only into this. It's like most people you talk to, like most of the time it's like, oh, what kind of music do you like? The majority of the answer that I hear is like everything except say country, or everything but hip hop and country. It's usually country for some reason, but maybe it's just the people I'm hanging around with. But
no, it's a real thing.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the music listener is just, because of that access to music, I guess, has kind of maybe diversified their tastes a little bit.
For sure. And I would say that especially for like listeners to stations like ours or like CKOA or whatever, is like, they've always been interested in discovering the new and the unknown. There's always going to be the listener that's like, no, I just want to listen to 80s music, or I just want to listen to classic rock, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree that, the listener is becoming a little bit more dynamic, but at the expense, that comes at fandom.
Yeah.
To a degree. I think of, iconic metal dudes you probably grew up with in high school, or punk rock dudes that would have like crass back patches on and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like I do think that's kind of under threat, because it's like well, if I listen to Kendrick Lamar, can I still wear my Misfits hoodie?
Yeah,
it's like, yes, you can, absolutely, but if the kind of self-conscious teenager-y person there, it's like, oh, I'll just not be part of a counterculture or any identifiable group. I'll just kind of listen to everything, and which is, I guess, probably good at the end of the day. But the fandom part's an interesting question, because it's like, I talk to my older friends that are like still following bands they were following when they were teenagers, and it's like, for me, it's like, well, I want to listen to a band as long as I'm interested in them, and then if they kind of like veer off the path, I just don't feel any sort of devotion to like, oh, I got to keep tabs on this band because I liked them 15 years ago. It's like, no, I'm onto something new. Don't care.
Yeah,
like
yeah, exactly. I'm very similar in my music listening approach. I find myself becoming more attracted and fans of albums aside from bands, it's like, oh, I like these 2 albums that this band put out a lot and I listen to them all the time, but everything else is like whatever, or it's like I find myself being more attracted to like, pieces of, because again, the evolution of a band, they're not going to continue making the same music throughout their entire careers. At least, hopefully, they're not.
Unless they're AC/DC in there.
Yeah, you're right. That's the band that got me started on my whole music journey.
Same here.
Yeah.
First concert I ever saw.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah.
No, that's I had this one live AC/DC album, and like I got it way back in junior high. My dad gave it to me, and I listened to that album so much, and I couldn't like find anything like that, because it was kind of back in the early 2000s, which was, it was harder to get music back then. Not as hard as it was like earlier than that, but it was still kind of difficult. Like things like Spotify, SoundCloud, streaming service, they didn't exist yet, and
Napster just shut down.
Yeah, exactly.
So there was like, and LimeWire hadn't the same critical mass as Napster ever did.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like still kind of hard to find things like that. And I just remember asking my friends, being like, "Oh, can you like make me CDs of like?"
Yeah, that AC/DC Live album actually had recordings from their Edmonton concert.
Yeah.
The Razor's Edge tour, which
Yeah.
was the first tour. Like that tour is my first concert.
Yeah.
No, that's it. It is weird. So you probably never grew up with like those Columbia House flyers where it's like 10 CDs for $1 type of thing like that.
Yeah.
And then, you would be on the hook to buy another 10 at like more than retail price.
Yeah.
And paying postage.
Yeah.
Did you ever have those?
I had that with the movie services, but not the CDs.
So yeah, that you probably just missed that, but that was
Yeah.
like your thing, and you would only ever get so much music. So like it's weird, like albums I listened to when I was in junior high and high school, I know still to this day probably inside and out, in a way that like my favorite album of last year, I probably have nowhere near the depth of familiarity with it, just because it's I never saw the artwork for it a zillion times like I did thumbing through a catalog or seeing it on a billboard or in a record store or whatever like that.
Yeah. I still there's something about like physically, like the ritual behind playing like physical music,
Absolutely.
like taking out the CD and like looking at the album, putting it in the thing, hoping it works and doesn't skip, or even like a record, putting the needle down. It's like more ritualistic almost, whereas like, and it's something that you had to kind of like set aside time to do.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, like I DJ in town at like a bar. I have a weekly residency, and I get one-off gigs from time to time. But I always feel like a fraud when I bring a computer. So I generally bring all records because I like the idea of like, oh, you want that request? If I got it, I'm playing it because I brought it with me.
Yeah.
If I don't have it, I honestly have no means of actually making this happen, or I'm actually doing a job right now. I have to go through the 700 or 800 different pieces of music I'm going through manually and kind of build a set. Like, it's not like I can just discreetly build a playlist hours before my gig and then just hit play and then go get wasted or go out for smokes or whatever that.
Yeah. I feel like it's, again, the accessibility of music is such a good thing for music and bad thing. It's kind of like, I love being able to have music on my phone, put it on when I'm doing the dishes or something. But I feel like when people do that, they kind of take it for granted a little bit. And I still appreciate the times where I just sit down and the only thing I'm doing is listening to music, and it's just, I'm just sitting down and I'm listening to this album, and I may be staring at the roof or whatever, but I think that maybe, I don't know, but I just feel like people aren't doing that as much anymore.
For sure. Well, and that kind of relates about that point I was making about the footprints we're leaving behind right now.
Yeah.
Will they still be visible 20 years from now? Like, when people talk about the 2010s, will it only be the top 40 music that's remembered?
Yeah.
You can look at to like the 80s, like, oh, everyone thinks 80s music was like, Flock of Seagulls and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, there's a huge part of it, but you also had the birth of hip hop, hardcore, like thrash metal, all these kind of things that were totally subculture things that are still remembered because there was physical media and like, people carve Slayer in their arms or into fresh concrete that's being poured on a sidewalk.
Yeah.
But now, like what will be remembered outside of top 40 stuff? I find that mystifying, and I can't wait to see what the answer to that question is. I guess we just got to wait for another 20 years or so. But will a band like the OCs or something like that, a band that has toured the world a zillion times, released as a bunch of great records, be remembered at all in any capacity? Who knows?
It is going to be interesting to see what happens with the future of music, because I think we've shifted away from the old model so much and so drastically that it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
And with that model of music too, it's like how, like, I'm an amateur musician. I've never looked to music to pay the bills, as it were. Like, I do it because I love it and it's fun playing music in front of people. But the people that look to monetize that as that idea, like, how do you make that work? Because the only way I can you can't download a concert, like or like a touring show, that like playing shows will always kind of be the thing, but will there be other avenues where people are able to monetize? I know Bandcamp I think is probably one of the best and most progressive services that kind of address that challenge, where it's like bands can name their own price on their album or whatever, or they give away for free. But and they offer like a very easy place to showcase your music to anyone that might be interested. And actually, it's a service that a lot of our programs here use, because is like, oh, I wonder what like Vancouver punk's sounding like right now. It's like, oh, great, they have these cool bands. There's Oath and Spectres and Dust Blaster and all these cool bands that are around and what have you. But what will happen if Bandcamp goes down?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's an interesting time, and I think we're kind of like we're approaching, a tipping point where it's going to go like one way or it's going to go the other, and it'll just be interesting to kind of see what the future of music holds.
For sure.
Yeah. So, do you maybe have any kind of in your 20 years here? Do you have like maybe any standout favorite moments?
Ooh, that's a super crazy tough one. There's been so many. Some that kind of come off the top of my head is we're right now in room 312 McEwen Hall. We used to be in room 127 McEwen Hall in the basement. A room that, after an environmental audit, was found not to be fit to be a janitor's broom closet. Like, there was asbestos and leaky ceilings and silverfish running the joint as much as everything. When we were able to move here, it was 10 years ago this year, from the downstairs upstairs, that was an incredibly huge thing. The downstairs had a certain je ne sais quoi, and that's where, like, I came up, like, in terms of being a programmer here and discovering the culture. But, we're in this beautifully appointed space that is the result of a combined strategic vision of fundraising and community engagement that has got us to this point. It's like it humbles me every time I walk in here. But that first time coming in and being kind of like, wow, this place is absolutely beautiful. We have so much more space. I see the future here. And we did not have a band studio like that downstairs. We did have something of a studio, but nowhere near as nice. We did not have the facilities to have 3 production studios. We had essentially 1.5. And, the technology we've got in here is, so much more advanced. And like that kind of progress, I found really, really enchanting. Another moment. So like in 2011, I had the foolish idea of, teaming up with my partner, not romantic partner, but business partner and roommate. We used to manage and run Broken City back in the day, and we were going to start a bar in Vancouver. And I did my last show in that year, and with the idea of like, oh, I'm never coming back, and that was a very emotional time. And the flip side of that is fast forward 1 year later to 2012, Vancouver's not working out. I need to come back. I got a job back in town. I move back. I get a call from the program director. It's like, hey, do you want to do a radio show again? I heard you're back in town. We have your exact old time slot just came up because the person covering it had to withdraw. I was like, yes. And coming back in for the first time and like, noticing that time had changed and like there was evolution and things were a little bit different in that year's time, but coming back to a place that has always felt as home to me was extremely impactful. And then lastly, I guess getting word that I got the job as station manager. It's like something like, we've had a lot of really talented people take the reins of CJSW, and the fact that this organization I've loved and been a part of for so long wanted to trust me with signing the checks, doing the HR, running the show, as it were, was extremely humbling and one of those things where it's like, I take this job as serious as a heart attack, and it's one that like I try to do every action out of love and that's my intention, is to work off a platform of love, and then the details will get sorted out. And having that kind of responsibility and trust in me by our membership via our board to give me the job was like kind of a huge thing in my time here. But I gotta say, those are like the big personal pivoting points, but I see it so many times when a programmer has their last show and we have a celebration and we have other volunteers come in and celebrate that program. We just had that yesterday. I think I was mentioning off mic, a programmer that is such a community player and has built a scene, like really built up the hip hop scene in town, did his last show yesterday. The hip hop community came here and freestyled. They had a band laying down basic kind of beats and stuff like that, and they were freestyling. They were talking about how much they love Jamal and how much they love this station, and it's one of those things like, wow, like I'm gonna cry a little bit. So I'm just cutting onions here, no big deal, like that kind of stuff. So it's a place where it's evergreen to me. Like there's always the best new day ever. It's almost like being a cat or something, where it says I'm woken up and today's gonna be the best day ever because I have no recollection of yesterday in that way. But every day, like there's always something kind of magical and new, and you see people grow, people change, people evolve and stuff like that. And, I find that fascinating. And I even try and step out myself as much as I can to see like, oh yeah, I was like this really kind of shy, dorky 18-year-old that came in here that thought I knew something about music but didn't know a damn thing, and then now I'm a shy, dorky 40-year-old, and I know a little bit more about music, and I've got so many more friends and connections and the good kind of responsibilities that come with this working or being associated with a place like this.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like there's a real, again, just kind of community family vibe around here, which is awesome, and it definitely shows through the programming, which is, I think, again, why people connect with it.
Totally. Yeah. And people will forgive. Like, it's funny when we have new hosts on and people text in, like longtime listeners, it's like, oh, you must be new, try doing this or stuff like that. Like, and it was like, frankly, that's how everyone learns. Yeah. We had a programmer, actually the person who used to do the Blues Witness before Cindy did, who we were talking about earlier. He was a character named Reverend Ron. He was like this, like old draft dodging cat that was from the States and came up here and did this great blues program. But I remember after my first interview, he sent me a note, and it devastated me. It was just like, critiquing my interview and technique. And it was a dog shit interview, but he did it. The way he did it was like, hey, this wasn't very good. Next time try this. Like there was a prescriptive element, but not couched in any sort of condescension or derision. Yeah. It was couched in a place of love. It's like, hey, if you're going to do this, like, why don't you do it right? But he punctuated his letter by like, you take it for what it's worth. I'm just an old wino. And it's like, I still have that note, and I still look at it from time to time because it's a good reminder of the valuable lessons of mentorship that you can get. And that's something, as I've grown up with this organization, like I'm way less interested in hearing like my musical point of view or voice on the air. I'm more interested in hearing the up and coming talent, like our 16-year-old classical programmer who does such an amazing show and makes a really dense and impenetrable genre seem very accessible. Like that kind of stuff excites me, and it's the new frontiers that keep me going. That's for damn sure.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's one of the reasons. Again, it's one of the reasons I do this podcast. I've talked to some of the younger generation as well, some of the up and coming acts like that, and it's just so interesting just hearing people's point of views, and I love being able to share those point of views with a wide ranging audience who maybe wouldn't necessarily get to hear these people talk in regular life.
Hell yeah.
So I can definitely, kind of empathize with that. I guess, is there any just kind of final things that you would like to say before we close out this interview?
Well, thank you for your time today, Cody, to talk with me. But to anyone tuning in, it's like, wherever you may be in Calgary, maybe elsewhere, chances are, if you live in North America, you are near a campus and community radio station. And if you care about, sharing the stories of your community, sharing the art, the music of your community, I would encourage you to go look them up, maybe volunteer with them. Chances are it might not be the right fit for you, but if it is something that you look to get involved with, like, do it. Take the plunge. It's an immensely rewarding thing. And if you are not destined to be a volunteer or a programmer at a radio station, support it, because institutions like ours took decades to create. In a couple pen strokes, they can be terminated. You got to treasure those things that add value to your community. Like, sure, having an IKEA in town is cool, but it doesn't make us a place. Having a strong community-powered voice, independent community-powered voice, is one of the elements that does make your city, wherever you may be, worth living in. Chain stores, who cares? It's the independent, small businesses, organizations, musicians, artists, writers, and media outlets that really are a reflection of the character of a community. And that's so important to sponsor, support, and be involved with.
I definitely agree with those sentiments, and I couldn't agree more, actually. And support local, whatever it may be.
For sure.
Because it strengthens the community and it improves the place where you live.
Yeah, and even on a economic side, it's like you're keeping your dollars in your community. Like, I always feel like a schmuck buying stuff from like a big box store. It's like, well, sure, I guess the franchisee gets some money, but it's not as much as like going down to the local provider of the same good. Or like, boy, it's sure convenient that there's fast food 24-hour places, but is it not more valuable to like support, like, oh, this place makes a really good burger. Tonight's burger night at Tubby Dog. I'm excited for it because they have the best burgers in town. It's not Five Guys, it's not McDonald's or whatever. Go to Tubby Dog.
Yeah, I agree. Support local. It's not only do you vote with your time, you vote with your dollar.
Absolutely.
So,
man, that was a big ass soapbox I got on. Sorry, Cody.
That's cool. Again, it's what podcasts are for. So thank you very much for being a guest on the show.
My pleasure.
If you liked this episode of the podcast, why not leave a review? You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. For up-to-date information on the podcast, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us at FrogE Style Productions. That's Frog, the letter E, Style Productions. For more ways to support the show, visit fsproductions.ca.